Now, as we discussed, in the previous class, that the central aspects of Hegelian's philosophy was basically its idealism, that is, the ultimate reality is spiritual rather than material, and God is the universal idea driving all history. And the many left Hegelians basically agreed with that fact, but Ludwig basically disagreed, and so he basically denounced the religion for being used by ruling elites to delude and control people. So he basically asserted that reality is ultimately material, and you are what you eat. That's the Ludwig basically, uh, reached the conclusions. So Marx basically saw Ludwig as a kind of, a standing hazel on his head, and agreed on this point. And he also denounced the role of religion and and God and anything that the left Hegelian try to propagate. As we discussed, that Hegelian groups basically divided into two groups, the left and the right. And so these are the right groups who basically denied, rejected the concept of spiritual rather than God, and so on and so forth, and then they went on with this understanding. So what basically came out in later period was known as the historical materialism. It basically means that all that happened in the historical context, there is a material I mean, there is this the matter is involved in all of this, and that's basically the point that Marx basically materialized Hegel's dialectic by using the French idea that the French Revolution was a conflict between socio-economic classes. The French Revolution was not about something great or something to bring about something new and all of that, which was conceived in the first place. And so after a major strike in Lyons in 1831, the followers of Babov, such as Joseph Proudhon, identified the central class conflict of the emerging industrial society to be between the bourgeois, that is capitalist, and the proletariat, that is working class. So these two concepts basically used by Marx in the later period of time, which we will discuss, how the bourgeois, how they called, the capitalists are called bourgeois, why they are called bourgeois, and the working class who are basically being exploited, and they are called proletariat. So here again, Marx found the key to historical materialism, that is the idea that the driving force of history is the dialectic between two conflicting socio-economic classes. That is the essence that the Karl Marx basically propounded, and later on he he divided. I mean, he basically developed his entire outlook and theory on the basis of this. And so this was crystallized in the line that opens the main body of the Communist Manifesto, and the history of all hitherto existing society has been the history of class struggle. And so that is the class struggle. Why the class struggle took place or is taking place in everywhere is basically the main theme that he try to explain in his theory, and we will discuss in this context as well in terms of historical materialism. Now this struggle concerns ownership and the control of means of productions. The control of the means of production about the who owns the resources, the productive means and a produce means of production. So one class owns and controls the means of production and thus exploits the other class which doesn't own. And that is the basically main theme of the historical materialism developed by Karl Marx. So the technology of a society, yes.
Please start the recording.
Hello.
Can you start the recording?
Why?
And sometimes we have bad network issues and the call gets disconnected. So for that.
Whose call is getting disconnected? Hello. You listen. Okay.
Yes.
And if you have any questions, you just ask me. I'm here. If you have been disconnecting anywhere, you just let me know right away. Okay. So the technology of a society, that is the forces of productions, combines with the structure of classes, that is the relations of productions, to determine the mode of productions. So here the forces of productions, that is the technology of a society, that whichever society that is, so they will be they use certain technology, that is obsolete technology or modern technology, but that is the force of production, and that force of production is combined with the structure of classes, that is the relations of production, and the classes, the haves and have-nots, and that determines the mode of production. So this is the structure, this is the substructure or base of a society that determines everything else, that is the mode of production. The superstructure, that is the religion, politics, culture, and so on and so forth. So these are superstructure, which is based on the substructure. And so first, that how the substructure has been determined, and that is resulting in the construction of the superstructure is basically the entire thesis of Karl Marx, socialism and communism, and which we will discuss through this historical materialism. So as the dialectic of class struggles proceeds, between have and haven'ts, the mode of production becomes qualitatively transformed into something different. And so therefore the mode of production of ancient Greece and Rome was slavery, characterized by the struggle between master and the slave. Again, the fall of the Roman Empire was actually arose from this contradiction, which is resulted in the mode of production transforming from slavery to feudalism. Again, in turn, feudalism was driven by the caste struggles between lord and serf, and was transformed into capitalism. So with its own struggle between the capitalists who owns the means of production and the worker who doesn't. So there you can see the historical context of that, how the mode of production is changing over the period of time. and the struggle continues. Now that is precisely the point that Karl Marx is trying to prove his theory using this historical context. That is what it's called, historical materialism. Okay. Now, as this struggle between have and haven't was to reach its apex in the most advanced capitalist countries such as England and Germany, there would be revolutionary transformations into socialism, right, with state ownership of the means of production, directions of production by common plan, income inequalities and wage payments, and control by a dictatorship of the proletariat. So therefore, what was basically conceptualized, right, by Marx and his subsequent followers is that this struggle between have and haven't will reach a peak apex, and when the capitalist countries will reach the extreme point, and there would be again revolution that will transform everything, and the ownership of means of production will be transferred to the state. Okay, and there will be a common plan, and so wage payments, income inequalities will be controlled by the proletariat leadership. And so in this, in his critique of the Gotha program written at the beginning of the 1970s, Marx basically declared that eventually communism would develop, and then all classes and property ownership would disappear, and the state would wither away. So what was basically said is that, okay, from the capitalists and proletariat, or bourgeois and proletariat conflict would be basically tackled by the state intervention. So state will take over the means of production, ownership of means of productions, and the state will not also be continuing, or state will not also persist in the long run, because eventually the state will be dismantled, and only the communism will be there. That is, only people will be there who would be deciding what to produce, how to produce, and when to produce. And that is the last phase of of Marxist or Marxian communism. And so that's a logically it is basically drawn, the logic, I mean the arguments are drawn logically in such a fashion that it looks scientifically solid, and it follows arguments, and it has got some solid empirical backing. Now that is basically the reasons why Marxism is still it's prevalent throughout the world even today. The left leaning groups are also very active in many countries, including the capitalist countries like US and Europe and other parts. And that is basically primarily because of this the growing conflicts between the different groups. And so now this is the point that so far we have come, that where how Marx drawn the idea that communism would be established in one point in time. That was his prediction, and people are expecting that the communism throughout the world would be established. Then, of course, next segment or next phase, we will try to understand that how he basically predicted the breakdown of capitalism. Okay. Now, as I said, that he studied very thoroughly the David Ricardo's labor theory of value, and so he used that labor theory of value, and he modified quite significantly the Ricardian labor theory of value, to predict the breakdown of capitalism. Why capitalism you know, should break down, and so that is basically the thing that So what he basically says is that after the crushing of the revolutions of 1848 in Germany, France, and other European countries, Marx fled to London and immersed himself in the study of classical British political economy to understand more fully the dynamics of capitalism. And so the interesting part is that he in fact participated actively in 1848 German and revolutions, and he was chased by the dispensary of that time of the government, and people in power, and then he had to flee, and he went to London, and there he basically immersed himself in the study of the classical British political economy to understand more fully the dynamics of capitalism, how the capitalism works. He found David Ricardo's labor theory of value, which argues that the value of a commodity is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor time it takes to produce it. Now, we have to understand the socially necessary labor time, okay? And so what it actually, uh, and what it actually does in terms of deciding the value of a product. And so this idea contradicts the new classical economic theory that value is co-determined by supply and demand, with capital and land contributing to the supply side of the equation. Okay, and so here again, we have to understand the new classical theory, which is basically talked about the interaction between supply and demand and how that determines the price of a product. And so that is basically one that we have to keep in mind. And while exploring what David Ricardo's main idea of the value of a product is actually largely derived from the labor time that that is required to produce the product, keeping other inputs, or using other inputs. So that's called the socially necessary labor time. Okay. And so now let us see what how Marx used that concept, and try to derive his theory of Marxism, and in that he predicted the breakdown of capitalism. Now Marx basically saw that the land and capital as a productive means, but not as a contributing to value. And so there's a basically the land and capital, these are productive means. Even this has to be used to produce a good, but to move that you need labor, so that is why labor only contribute to value, not the other way around, which the new classical economics use in other way in terms of supply and demand, and land also come in terms of supply side. Okay. So the following Ricardo, he fundamentally argued that land rent was due only to differences in the productivity of different land locations, and that marginal land earns zero rent and the true return to pure land. Now, so that is basically again the idea that productivity of different patches of land can be determined on the basis of the comparison between marginal land and the other land, that is cultivable fertile land. And so that is basically what he called the true returns to pure land. So also he's basically again following Ricardo. He basically saw capital goods as being the product of past labor, which is very interesting, which we generally don't consider that, which is that to produce capital also you need again labor time. And so value of a capital is also nothing but it's a indirect labor value. Okay, but
No, sir,
again
can you explain the land part? I couldn't understand that.
sorry,
Can you explain that marginal land owns zero rent, that part?
just one second, somebody is trying to. Okay, you wanted to know that the marginal land, right?
Yeah, the marginal land.
Yeah, the land rent is basically determined on the basis of what? The suppose you have different segments of lands are there, different patches of lands are there. Okay, so one is highly fertile, another is basically what? I mean, your fertile lands are basically are cultivated in the first place, isn't it? Wherever you could grow crops. Now, the point is that the rent is not that how much the fertile land is giving, how do you determine? So you need some kind of comparison in terms of how the land is basically derived. So that is based on the marginal land, which basically earns zero rent, because marginal land is basically the additional land which is basically coming in as a result of the scarcity of uh, land resources, and you are basically the demand for food grains is actually growing up. So you have to always add the other land which is not cultivated before. Okay, maybe they are substandard or they are marginal or degraded land, and you have to move into that directions. Okay, now between fertile land and the marginal land, so you get the differences of productivity, isn't it? So the land rent, sorry, the land rent is determined on the basis of the differences between the productive land and the uh, what the uh, the marginal land, okay, or subsistence land, the
So,
land
but
that has
how is the productivity measured here?
uh,
Like it is relative, right? Like some patches of land can be fertile, and
yes,
the
that
patches
is
can be
what.
more fertile than
So
that.
that is what that's precisely the point. So the land, the fertility of the land, is on the basis of the rent for the fertile land is determined. I mean, yeah, basically the land parcel is taken as a kind of homogeneous. Okay, but
Okay.
the fertility is not considered in the first place as the Ricardo suggested, because Ricardo said that okay, you first pick up the land which is cultivable and you grow. So as your demand increases, so you move into the more marginal land. So the rent is basically you are deriving from in comparison to the marginal land. Okay, so tomorrow I'll show you the graph that today I don't know where I have kept. So that graph is basically will be very clear in terms of how the land rent is determined. Okay, because every parcel that you bring in for into cultivation, the previous land's productivity is basically comes as compared to the what you bring in the additional patch of land into the cultivation. So that's how the differences is made. Okay, and so for today you just keep this in mind, and tomorrow we will talk in great detail. So once I bring the Ricardian that wage theory, and then that graph will be much more clear. And so what is more interesting about is that, what Karl Marx is basically seeing behind the, everything, how the value is determined. So the labor theory of value is basically, all he wants to see is that the land and capital, they are simply the productive resources. They need manpower to be made useful and to be produce anything out of that. And again, he sees that, the capital itself is actually being, the product of the past labor, because some labor has also gone into that to produce that, simply what he calls the indirect labor. Okay. Again, he went beyond, Ricardo, in asserting that the true reality of capital is not the capital good itself, but the social relations of exploitation between the capitalist and the workers. Because, the understanding that he gets, of course, the capital is produced by the capitalists because they had a lot of money and they have entrepreneurial skill, and so they use people, those who have skill, and in producing the capital, so the whatever capital is produced by the labor, and they are not equally compensated. I mean, the value of a capital is not given to the producers of that capital, that is the labor. So that was basically argument. On the basis of that, the Marx went on to, logically deriving the theory, his theory. So this assertion is the core of the, what we call the Marxian doctrine. Okay. And so so the social relation of exploitation between capitalists and the workers is the main doctrine of Marxian theory. And even today, people who are writing about inequality during, COVID time, and all of this literature also, emerging, they're saying that the poorer people and the working class people's, their living standard has gone down, almost drastically. I mean, and whereas the capitalists, their overall wealth has doubled. And this is the case both in almost all capitalist countries. I mean, the market economy countries, wherever, I mean, from China to US to India and everywhere else. And that's precisely the point that, that the left, inclined people, or the people, those who are, following Marx, basically asserting that there is something wrong in terms of, the who owns resources, the productive resources, and what are the social relations of and all of that. Okay, so that's basically the point. Now, just to elaborate on this, let us try to understand, using this Marxian doctrine, that how Marx predicted that capitalists or capitalism will collapse eventually. Okay, in the process. So now let us see that what kind of scientific logic, or logic that he provided. So the value of, here, what he is basically trying to understand is the value of a commodity W is consist of three components. One is that constant capital, okay, that is C. Second is the variable capital, that is V. And third is the surplus value, that is S. So the constant capital and variable capital and surplus value, and all of that together basically forms the value of a commodity W. So C here is that, corresponds roughly to fixed capital stock, which, in our economics we use the fixed capital as measured in the labor time required to produce it. So it's basically measured in terms of how many labor has gone in producing that fixed capital. Again, the V represents the value of labor power used in production, I mean, in terms of producing a good, you need labor power to run the machine, to think, do things, etc. So that is basically represented by the variable capital, that is V. That is the the value of labor power used in productions. Now, applying the labor theory of value to labor itself, it is the amount of socially necessary labor time it takes to reproduce labor, okay, equal to a subsistence wage. So what is basically we should understand is that the value of labor power, suppose you have 10 labor days is required, let's say, to produce X unit of output. Now, what is the value of that labor power used? How do you determine it? Okay. So the Marx basically, apply the labor theory of value uh, to labor itself, where it's saying that how much resources, right? How much or what is the amount of socially necessary labor time it takes to reproduce the labor capital, so the labor equal to a subsistence wage. Now, so that is basically, saying that the labor time required to reproduce labor. That means you need food, shelter, and clothing. That's a subsistence minimum basic necessary thing to survive and to be able to healthy, to be able to be productive in the workplace. So how much labor again required for that? It's basically, running to itself all the time, and so this point it should be clear to all of you, okay? Like how much you need food and shelter and basic things to survive and to be healthy. So for that, all of these things has to be arranged, by using labor power or labor time. So that's what it means, okay? So that is again V. Now V is basically, it's a variable cost, so it varies in terms of how much labor time is required to reproduce the labor that is required. Now again, coming back to the other concept that he has used, that is called surplus value. Now this is a very it's an interesting way to the way he basically derived the Hegelian dialectic. Using the Hegelian dialectic, then he tried to look at the class conflicts between have and have-nots, and all of that. So from there, basically, he is deriving the surplus value concept. So here, the surplus value is Marx modifications of the labor theory of value. Now, this is not, something that Ricardo didn't use, but then Ricardo used it in case of land value and using the land value that and then, but the Marx basically used that concept in terms of deriving the surplus value. So here basically again, the surplus value, what he says is that value created by the worker but taken away by the capitalist and leading to the exploitations and alienations at the heart of the capitalism. Now, how does that happen? That's basically the point, the entire controversy as far as the Marxian theory is concerned or doctrine is concerned. So if you are producing a software as a worker, you produce the software, but you don't get the total value of the software. You simply get your wage, whatever wage is determined before that. But the software could be many times higher value, and that those extra value, according to Marx, is basically exploited by the capitalists because they have capital and they have resources and they could able to employ people and get the things produced, etc. So according to Karl Marx, It is out of surplus value that the capitalists obtain profit. So the profit is basically coming from the surplus value, not from the capital, right? Because the surplus value, what he sees is basically the exploitations and alienations of of the working class people, and so they are not given the total value of the produce that they are producing. Okay. So is this clear to all of you so far? Somewhat clear or not?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. If it is clear to all of you, then we will proceed in terms of how he, predicted this collapse of capitalism, the breakdown of capitalism. So here, the total value of a commodity W is nothing but a constant capital and variable capital and the surplus value. Okay. And so here again, the constant capital is C, which we discussed. It's a fixed capital. The variable capital is basically labor used, the labor power used in production.
So here the constant capital is like the machineries and all, right?
I'm sorry.
So here the constant capital we're talking about are the like machines and all, right?
Machines, yes.
Yeah.
Machines and all are fixed capital.
Yeah.
They are machines and equipment, etc. Okay, and so that's what now. So here basically is saying that the variable capital is basically the value of labor used in production. That is the labor theory of value to labor itself. I mean, it is the amount of socially necessary labor used to to reproduce labor. That is basically, and the surplus value is basically we determined on the basis of the the value that are created by the labor but taken away by the capitalists. And so that is basically the argument that he is making. Now here comes the question that your W is basically total value of a commodity, which is comprises of these three variables. And so here Q is basically what we call organic compositions of capital, that is C upon C plus V. Okay. And so now the the S is the here is basically rate of exploitations, that is S is basically S upon V, that is surplus value upon the variable capital. And so similarly the P is basically rate of profit is basically derived from S upon C plus V. And so that is basically the thing that is put in here. See, Marx here basically argues that the capitalists are inevitably driven to engage in capital investment by their competitions with each other, and thereby raising the organic compositions of capital, that is Q here. And the C upon C plus V is basically, if you look at this, that if the capitalist increases the C all the time, keeping the V constant, and so you will see that they are actually not making so much profit, in the sense that the capitalist constant capital doesn't give as Karl Marx basically predicted, that it is the V that is basically the variable capital. That is basically the point that he is saying. But then this V is basically again is a reason behind the generations of surplus value. That is basically the S by V. And so the surplus values are basically coming from the variable capital. And so what basically the Karl Marx argued that the tendency of the capitalists is to simply increase the organic compositions of capital, and whatever profit they make is primarily because of this. So it is easy to see that if C rises, while S and V are constant, then the rate of profit will decline. This is the point, that the rate of profit is basically here, S by C plus V. And so if C and V is constant, then obviously that is the thing that he is talking about, that if C is rising and S and V are constant, okay, S and V are constant, then the profit will decline. That's precisely the point here with this equation. And so this sounds logical in the sense that as long as that V and S is variable, so that is this I mean the capitalist has the things to maneuver and make profit out of that. Now, and so then now the question basically that he is raising is that in terms of what the tendency of capitalism is all about, is that the capitalist tendency is to increase the C, the constant capital, and that is basically the point, so that basically means that this S and V will be basically constant, but then that is the tendency of the capitalist to increase C, and at the same time, to make profit they have to play with S and V in terms of giving them low wage, no holidays or nothing, and the exploitations will basically increase. That S by V will basically the increase the surplus value. And so the capitalists destroy themselves as a group as each tries to gain a competitive edge on the other. And that was basically another fundamental the point that Karl Marx added here, in the sense that the very tendency of the capitalist is to accumulate more and more capital in order to basically outsmart the other capitalists in race for higher profit and capture the market share and so on and so forth. And he also talked in great deal about that, how the big fish eat the small fish, etc. The mergers and acquisitions and all of that is also the tendency that Marx has seen in the beginning, that this is what basically will lead them to fall at the end, because the organic compositions of capital is not going to help them to generate profits on a long term continuous basis. So what they have to do is basically they have to exploit the labor class, whoever is engaged in the in production activities, and that exploitations will reach a maximum, and that will basically become unbearing for the working class people, and then the revolution will start. That was basically the fundamental logic that he is giving. So the dialectic that we started off, the Hegelian dialectic between two opposing forces and so on and so forth, from that logic what Karl Marx derived the historical materialism. And the dialectic basically leads capitalists to try to increase the rate of exploitation, that is, as we, and either by lowering the wages that they are offering to the people, I mean the labor class, thereby immiserating the worker, or by working them longer and harder, and all of that they have to do in order to make profit. So these efforts intensify the class struggle and the increasing severity of commercial crisis, what we call recession. That's basically he predicted. And thus one capitalist always kills many. So this uh, leads to an increasing concentrations of capital in fewer and fewer hands because of mergers and acquisitions, and while the proletariat expands and becomes more miserable and more conscious of its condition. So eventually the contradiction between the forces of production, right, that is the technology used in the productions, and the relations of productions becomes intense between the social relations between the labor class and the capitalists, and the system is overthrown by the revolutionary working class, who would be basically raising revolutions and overthrow the capitalists and then take over all the process of decision making process, etc. And that was basically the whole whole gamut of the Marxian doctrine that was propounded by Marx with his theory. Okay, so is this all clear to all of you, that how he predicted the collapse of capitalism?
Yes, so
Okay, so then we will proceed to further evolutions of these ideas, that how there are again divisions was created. We see that every time a new things, new ideas emerged, and there are also divisions of of that ideas, and the groups are divided. And similar we have seen in case of Hegelian dialectic, and we are also seeing also here. So there are also controversies in socialism. So in controversy, again the groups are divided on the basis of orthodoxy and revisionisms. Now that the Marx predicted the collapse of capitalism, but the capitalism didn't collapse even today after hundreds of years. And why it didn't happen? So there are again a lot of views and counter views with that. Some people, they say that that capitalists, they are very smart species, so they saw what Karl predicted, and they become very smart, and they started raising the wage and so on and so forth, become friendly with the workers and given the share with workers, and the workers' revolutions were suppressed, etc. So all of these things basically talked about. But then the Marxist followers, some of them are very orthodox in terms of that, they think that no, this is it is the collapse of capitalism is an eventuality. It is likely to happen anytime, or we have to wait and see. And the revisionists said that okay, no, we have to revise our theories, etc., with the emerging equations between the proletariat and bourgeois. So all of that are basically the point here. Now, by the time of the Engel's death, which was happened in 1895, now difficulties had arisen for the Marxists of the German Socialist Democratic Party, and the German Social Democratic Party is still today, I think they are having this political party, and it's called Socialist Party. And not only had capitalism not collapsed, but real wages were rising, therefore undermining the expectations of the imminent arrival of revolutions, by the followers of the Marxist. The first Marxist to point this out was, Edward Bernstein, in his 1899 book called Revolutionary Socialism. Now Bernstein basically argued that since conditions were improving, a reformist and gradualist approach through parliamentary democracy should be used to achieve gains for the working class, which was actually quite radical thinking. Of course, he's writing at the in 1899, where democracy is actually coming up slowly, uh, in America and other places, etc. And it is maturing and it is spreading to other countries in Europe. And so his arguments were, quite valid at the time, that the parliamentary democracy is an instrument that can be used to, achieve a lot of these things for the working class. And this eventually became the policy of the German Social Democratic Party, which still exists, and more generally of modern European social democracy. Now, so Bernstein's arguments basically provoked a counterattack by the orthodox Marxist. And so the Karl Kautsky, who argued that economic crises were becoming ever more severe, that eventually there would be a chronic depression. But again, Kautsky, as a leader of the German Socialist Democratic Party, practiced revisionism as a policy while waiting for the expected revolution's upheaval. And so again, when the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia, so Kautsky criticized them and openly supported revisionism's parliamentary reform program. And because that was again a different divisions of that. The Bolsheviks are basically a hardcore orthodox Marxist who wants to establish state controlled systems, and that is when basically the Russia was basically one that that led on that front. And Kautsky and other people in Germany, they also try not to support such kind of what we call the direct interventions in that process. It's not spontaneous, but it's directly they are trying to take over the everything as Marx predicted. So besides influencing the social democracy, revisionism influenced market socialist reforms later in Eastern Europe. Okay. So now this, after these issues between orthodoxy versus revisionism and so on and so forth, the other point basically came the idea why the Marx predictions was not materialized, why the capitalist systems didn't collapse. And that was basically again the other theory is about the theory of imperialism and Marxism Leninism. So the explanations is that the failure of capitalism to collapse, this is another explanation given by John Hobson, which is called the theory of imperialism. So the advanced capitalist countries basically had reduced their internal contradictions by engaging in the conquest of less developed countries, especially exemplified in the scramble for Africa among the major European powers in the late 19th century. So what is basically theory is that most of the advanced capitalist countries, or especially the European countries, they had reduced their internal contradictions. And how do they did that? And how did they do it? Basically by conquering a lot of these less developed countries, especially in Africa, what they call the scramble for Africa. So all of these countries, they just went on and they just fought war there, and they just tried to capture, land, so there they could create a captive markets and supply themselves inexpensively with raw materials. So that's basically what we call the colonialism. India and other countries, they had gone through a long period of colonialism, exploitations of resources, creating a captive market for their products, and all of that has actually happened in Africa by the European countries, and a lot of the Asian countries also, is impacted by that. The idea is that because of this, they had actually moved away. I mean, they created. I mean, they try to, resolve their internal problems, that conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeois in their own system. Now, the Vladimir is known as Lenin. He developed the imperialism theory thesis in his 1916 imperialism books. What he calls is imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. So refocusing revolutionary expectations on less developed countries become what people call Marxism, Leninism. So the official Soviet doctrine after 1917, and the guiding light of Marxist revolutions in the 21st or 20th century in less developed countries, from China to Cuba to Vietnam. So all of these basically, become what people call the Marxist doctrine. They follow the Marxist doctrine, and accordingly, the state becomes important part of that. The other controversies in socialism is the anarchism and syndicalism. Okay. So the radical, another strand of the radical thought and activity was that of anarchism and its close relative, that is syndicalism. Now we have to understand the difference between these two. Now, because both concepts argued that the state should be abolished outright, and for the anarchists, this often led to conspirational violence directed at, assassinating heads of state. Okay, that is what is called anarchism. Anarchist. Even today, some people, they use the word called an anarchist. Anarchist idea is basically to kill the state heads and then capture the power, like that, assassinate them. Now, for the anarchists, this led to conspirational violence directed at assassinating the heads of state. And so successful efforts included basically the 1881 assassinations of Alexander II, the liberal Tsar, who basically emancipated the Russian Serbs, and the 1901 assassinations of US President William McKinley. So all of these basically, an attempt by the anarchists to capture power. So anarchism was again founded in 1793 by William Godwin of Britain, whose wife, again Mary Wollstonecraft, is regarded as the founder of feminism. And he was influenced by Rousseau. Godwin argued basically that without government, people will peacefully organize themselves into a harmonious, non-oppressive order. And this view has links with both utopian socialism and modern libertarianism. And the libertarianism is basically, again, I think we discussed that, where people think that the state is basically not a good thing to so the libertarianism basically allows people to organize freely themselves and engage in productions and consumption activities based on what they want. So in 1840, Joseph Proudhon linked anarchism with communism and the revolutionary working class movement in his book called What is Property? And he said that property is, the blunt answer that he gave is property is theft. And so they basically went against the ownership of property. And so in the 1860s, he became the father of the French trade union movement, which was long anarchist. And but Marx viewed these positions as fuzzy-minded and unscientific people. And so that's again another segment of people who wants to have the socialism, but in a forced manner, in a very violent, using a violent path. So Marxism and anarchism, they basically competed in the 1860s after Marx founded the First International. Again, his main rival was the Russian anarchist Prince Michael Bakunin, who supported conspirational and violent revolutions and ridiculed Marx for his statist tendencies. So the Bakunin had strong support among the workers' movements in Spain, Italy, Switzerland, and France. And in 1872, he appeared on the verge of taking control of the First International, leading Marx to dissolve the organization. And so in the 1890s, the pro-anarchist trade unions in the above countries argued that after the abolition of the state, society should be run by the trade unions themselves, with production being directly controlled by the workers at the production site. Now, this philosophy is known as syndicalism. So you have the one hand the anarchists, another hand is by syndicalism, syndicalists, who are basically trade unions leaders and working class people who will be basically deciding about different activities in terms of what to produce, how to produce, and when to produce. So there are again some divisions, clear case of divisions of socialism since 1917. So one of the, we will try to briefly go into that. The Trotskyism is one. Okay, now Leon Trotsky, who is basically former Menshevik and founder of the Red Army in the Soviet Union, and he was basically Joseph Stalin's chief rival for power after Lenin's death in 1924. Okay, and he exiled in 1927. Trotsky basically founded the Fourth International, which fragmented into factions after his assassination in 1940 in Mexico by a Stalinist agent. So Trotsky and Stalin agreed about the need for rapid industrializations in the Soviet Union, and but they disagreed about whether this should be done in isolations or in an international context. Now, Trotsky basically supported the idea of an international permanent revolutions, believing that true socialism could not be achieved in the Soviet Union without an international revolution. And he criticized Stalin for his dictatorial and bureaucratic tendencies. And so from there, the Trotskyism. Now let's look at the Titoism. Now Titoism basically developed as a kind of practice before it became an ideology. So Joseph Broz, known as Marshal Tito, he led the communist partisans in throwing the Nazis out of Yugoslavia during Second World War, and without any assistance from the Soviet Red Army. So initially a strong Stalinist, Tito basically broke with Stalin in 1948 and declared the political independence of Yugoslavia from Soviet influence. And this led to an effort to develop a distinctive economic systems for Yugoslavia that would basically reinforce the separate path that Tito had chosen. So the systems adapted was workers managed market socialism, and this was described by some as quasi syndicalists. It's basically workers managed, but again trade unions are also involved in that. And so in Tito's Yugoslavia, it consisted of state-owned enterprises in a one-party state operating with little central planning according to market forces and with managements appointed by worker-selected boards. So here again, the interesting ideas that Marshall Tito basically introduced: no central planning or little central planning, but state will be operating under market forces, and management appointed by the workers selected boards. So all of these are basically radical
So what
reforms.
is central planning?
Sorry?
So what is the central planning we're talking about here?
No, central planning we discussed yesterday. I think in the last class. Central planning is basically in a socialist economy. If you look, everything is owned by the state, isn't it? And how do you run the economy? I mean, you have to plan, na? So central planning board is the authority who decides what to produce, how to produce, when to produce, and everything. All the decisions are made by them. That was the essence of the socialist system. In the absence of market, how do you allocate resources? We discussed that in the introductory classes, isn't it?
Yes, I got it. Forgot
Yeah.
it.
So there all the bureaucratic, like we had this planning commission in India, right? And
Yes.
like even today, some of the Japan and France, they had also, the planning commissions and planners. And now, those are basically, again, the idea is basically you have to give some directions to certain sectors which you think is important, not depend on the on the market to do the job. And so that was basically the central. But in socialist economic structures, the central planning commission is the basically the main thing. Okay. And so just 1 second, just 1 second. Yeah, so let us try to look at what the, this is basically Tito's main. So we'll study, of course, Yugoslavia as a country has disappeared, but we'll study that model in detail when it comes to the, the different economies in the world. And so we will discuss that in transition economy, and then we try and understand that. So, next is basically the division that we saw is the Maoism, which is created another, very influential group. And so in 1949, a communist insurgency led by Mao Zedong took power in mainland China. And the Maoist basically road to power was characterized by a reliance on a rural guerrilla movement that encouraged egalitarianism or egalitarian economic development in zones of revolutionary control. So immediately after its 1949 communist revolutions, China basically was quite friendly with the Soviet Union and imitated the centrally planned command industrializations model of Stalin's country. So nevertheless, in China, there was of course always more emphasis upon rural agricultural development as well as upon egalitarianism and the use of moral incentives. I think we discussed that, serve the people, etc. All of the slogans are given by Maoist. And so that was one strong thing. And so in the great proletariat cultural revolutions at its height from 1966 to 69, Mao basically emphasized industrial decentralizations throughout the country, complete communalizations of agriculture, total, egalitarianism and moral incentives, and the complete, obliterations of all vestiges of, previous culture. And so that was basically a massive exercise that he undertook, so he communalized the entire agriculture systems, given it to the communities, and totally egalitarian. So no one owns the property, and properties are owned by communities. And there was moral incentives. The people are guided by only moral incentives. And so in many third world countries, they become very powerful rural guerrilla movement opposing both capitalism and Soviet-supported leftist groups, notably, in Angola, Cambodia, and Peru. Even in Nepal and in India and some other parts, there this guerrilla, warfare movements is very active. So 2 years after, Mao's death in 1976, his philosophy was repudiated in China, and this was largely but not totally followed by a decline of support for Maoism amongst its adherents. Although many of these movements continue to follow the rural guerrilla strategies recommended by Mao. And so despite this general decline, a new Maoist movement has gained strength recently in rural Nepal and some parts of India, which is basically still going on in some remote districts. Okay. Now, let's try to look at, what is the theory of economic socialism. After all of these divisions of socialisms and controversy of socialisms, let us look at what exactly the socialism is all about. The first serious analysis of socialist planning followed neoclassical theory rather than the Marxist theory. So the socialist planning controversies began in 1908, and so with the baroness, the Ministry of Productions in the collective states. Basically, Baronet adapted the Pareto efficiency analysis of the Wallacean general equilibrium model. So he posited as systems with no money and the state determining equivalences, the relative prices between goods and distributing them through state stores in exchange for goods bought by people. But then, the Ministry of Productions would basically have to know all costs of productions and all demand functions and all capital stocks. So from this, a general equilibrium could be solved for a collective maximum that would basically correspond to an efficient competitive equilibrium, in that the cost of productions would be minimized and the price would equal the cost of production. So Ludovic basically in 1920, critiqued the practicality of this proposal. He said the money is necessary to calculate prices. The artificial market of the experimenting socialist central planner can never generate, rational prices because of insufficient incentive. He basically argued that the profit motive based on the private ownership of capital is the fundamental driving force in this Austrian school view. And so here, the practice basically preceded the theory in the development of command socialist central planning. So the central planning first appeared in Soviet Russia with the 1920 re-electrification plan. Yeah, basically Lenin sloganeered the communism equals Soviet dictatorship plus electrification. And so with the de facto market socialists, so new economic policy in 1921, indicative planning was instituted by several heavy industrial sectors under state ownership such as electricity, steel and cement. And that was again carried out using the material balance method, which basically became the main planning method used by the Soviet Central Planning Authority, what they call Gosplan. And so that was basically the introductions of the comprehensive command planning in 1928. Now let us look at the basic outline of Soviet central planning. What are those? Now, the first is that long-term planning was on a 5-year time horizon. 5-year planning horizon, which was actually in India also we had these 5-year plans. Okay, it's basically followed this Soviet pattern of, central planning. The 5-year plans were broken down into, into 1-year plans, from which monthly, quotas for individual farms were derived. So each farm had a, track from plan, or what they call technical production financial plan. So they specified output quantities, prices, input quantities, and prices, including wages and also levels, kinds of capital investment for the farm. That presumably basically consistent with those for the other farms. And now for the first 5-year plan, okay, the material balances were based on inherited structure of the productions, involving, figuring out how much of which final goods were to be produced, and then amounts of all of the inputs required to produce those outputs were basically estimated, and the inputs to produce those inputs, and further, and so on and so forth. So if more tanks were to be produced, so this required more steel, which requires more coal, more iron, and as well as more steel to produce the machinery used in mining coal and iron ore, and so on and so forth. So sources of inputs could be again, productions, imports, or previously existing stocks. And so all of that basically the points which basically comes in terms of the 5 characteristics distinguishing the participatory economy. Here again, the theory of economic socialism also includes these participatory or cooperative alternatives. So here, in this case, the workers will manage the firms. In practice, this has usually involved management by professional managers hired by workers, control boards, and there will be income sharing, often thought by many theorists to be the same as wages equaling the average product of labor. Okay, so the productive resources are not owned by the workers and therefore must be paid by rentals. So all the workers enjoy usufruct rights to the fruits of the operations, and so that is basically the main idea of what they call the participatory or cooperative alternative, which is basically Tito, the Marshall Tito's framework. But again, all of this will be based on a market economy, and so workers can freely choose where to work. So freedom of choice is given to the workers, and so these are basically some of these what we call the theory of economic socialism. Okay, and so if you have any questions on this, you can ask me. Okay, and so tomorrow we will look at the new traditional economy. Okay, and so we have basically covered the details of market capitalism, okay, market capitalist system, and the socialist systems. Okay, these two extreme economic systems that is being talked about historically, and even today also it has got relevance, and but in between there are many other things are there that shapes economic systems, and we will cover that, basically our institutions, the culture, traditions, how they also influence the economic systems. That we will cover from tomorrow onwards. And so at least the Marxism, socialism, and communism, I think this concept is clear to all of you, right? At least conceptually. Clear or not? Do you have any questions? Okay. If you don't have questions, then we will stop here. Okay. We will tomorrow we will continue the new traditional economy, and then we will.
So can you share the slides?
Yeah, have you got the book? I have referred.
Yeah, the comparative development research.
That book you download. It's freely available. If you're not getting, then you let me know.
All right.
MIT book. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, you start reading that, and you know that we have already announced the exam, class tests, and so you all should start reading at least a little bit of the exam. Okay.
What will be the pattern of questions in the exam?
Questions can be objective, subjective, but again, questions will be not direct. So you have to apply your mind and theory and then answer. Okay. Okay. So that's why conceptually you should have some clarity in order to be able to answer nicely. Okay. Okay, so if no one is having any questions, so you can disperse and let us meet tomorrow.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.